his words. Was he mocking her, or had he glimpsed the turmoil beneath her composed exterior? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, only a surge of resentment that rose unbidden in her chest. "What I keep silent is my own business," she replied at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I assure you, it has no bearing on my work here." Thomas tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "Perhaps, but I suspect your silence speaks louder than you realize." The words hung in the air between them, thick with implication. Eliza's pulse quickened, the tension in the room growing unbearable. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, and it made her skin prickle with a mix of frustration and something far more dangerous, something she refused to name. She turned away abruptly, forcing herself to breathe. She wouldn't let him see how he unsettled her, how his mere presence stirred emotions she had long tried to bury. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Harrington, I have work to attend to." Without waiting for a response, Eliza swept from the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence left behind. As she moved down the hall, her heart still raced, a mixture of anger and confusion swirling within her. What was it about him that made her so aware of herself, of the gap between them? Was it simply the injustice of her situation, or was it something deeper, something that frightened her to even acknowledge? She hated the way he looked at her, as if seeing straight through the walls she had carefully constructed around her heart. And yet, she couldn't deny the strange pull that existed between them, the way his presence seemed to fill every corner of the manor, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. As she approached the schoolroom where the children awaited her, Eliza paused for a moment, steadying herself. She could not, would not, allow Thomas Harrington to break her resolve. She was here for a purpose, and she would not be distracted by the lingering ghosts of the past or the enigmatic man who now ruled her former home. But even as she resumed her work, instructing the children with calm precision, Eliza could not shake the feeling that something was shifting between her and Thomas, something neither of them could stop. Chapter 4. Beneath the Willow. Eliza stood beneath the ancient willow tree, the soft weeping branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, their tips brushing against her shoulders like the delicate fingers of a forgotten memory. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the world in hues of gold and rose, but the beauty of the moment did little to soothe the restlessness that churned inside her. This tree, with its knotted trunk and branches that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the heavens, had been her sanctuary as a child, a place where the burdens of the world could be forgotten. But now, standing here again, the past weighed heavier than ever before. She exhaled slowly, allowing her fingers to trace the ridges of the bark, grounding herself in its solid presence. In her mind, she could almost hear the laughter of her younger self, running through the fields that had once belonged to her family. The days when Willowbrook had been theirs felt distant, yet painfully close, as if the memories were just beyond her grasp. She had thought coming back to this place would offer some solace, but instead it only reminded her of everything she had lost. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind her, breaking her from her thoughts. Eliza didn't need to turn to know who it was. She could feel the tension that accompanied his presence even before he spoke. "Miss Carter." Thomas's voice was low and even, though there was something different about it, less formal, more tentative. "I didn't expect to find you here." Eliza swallowed the sharp reply that threatened to rise. She had come to this place for peace, not for another confrontation with the man who embodied everything that had gone wrong in her life. She kept her gaze on the rippling water of the nearby stream, watching the light dance on its surface. "And yet here I am," she replied, her voice steady but cool. "It seems we're both drawn to the past, Mr. Harrington." Thomas stepped closer, his shadow joining hers in the fading light. He was silent for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. When he spoke again, his tone was softer, almost hesitant. "This place." I didn't know it meant so much to you." Eliza's fingers tightened around the Willow's trunk. The audacity of his ignorance stung more than she had expected. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. His face was cast in the warm glow of the setting sun, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the stormy grey of his eyes. For all his composed arrogance, there was a flicker of something deeper in his gaze now, something that made her heart stutter in a way she despised. "It was my home," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Every inch of this place is woven with memories I cherished, memories that your family so easily took from me." Thomas flinched at her words, a slight but telling reaction. He shifted his weight, glancing away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "I'm not my father, Eliza. I didn't ask for any of this." The use of her first name caught her off guard, but she quickly composed herself, refusing to let it soften her. "No, you didn't ask for it. But you've done nothing to change it either. You've inherited all the privileges without questioning how they came to be yours." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy and unrelenting. Thomas's brow furrowed, the usual aloofness in his expression giving way to something rawer, more human. He took another step closer, so close now that Eliza could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. But still, she did not move. "I never wanted this life," he admitted quietly, the vulnerability in his voice startling her. "The expectations, the legacy, it's suffocating." Eliza blinked, momentarily disarmed by his candor. This was not the man she had expected, the proud, arrogant heir of the Harrington estate. His words revealed cracks in the mask he wore, and for the first time, Eliza saw beyond the title and the estate. She saw a man burdened by his own inheritance, trapped in a gilded cage. "You speak of suffocation?" she asked, incredulous. "Your life may be full of expectations, but at least it is your life, with every door open to you. I had no choice but to become a governess in the home that should have been mine." Thomas's gaze softened. "I know you've lost more than I could ever understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And if I could change what happened to your family, I would." Eliza's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to cling to her anger, to the bitterness that had sustained her since she'd stepped foot back in Willowbrook, but his words were stripping her of her defenses. She hated that he could reach her like this, hated that she felt the pull toward him, even as her mind screamed against it. The air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. The willow branches above them swayed gently in the breeze, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Thomas's hand hovered near her arm, as if he wanted to reach out but wasn't sure if he should. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how close they were standing now, their faces mere inches apart. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice barely audible, but the question held the weight of everything she'd been holding back. "Why does any of this matter to you?" Thomas's eyes searched hers, and for a brief, aching moment, the mask he had worn since they met slipped entirely. "Because I care about you," he said, his voice hoarse with sincerity. "More than I should, more than is wise." Eliza felt the world tilt beneath her, the words sending a jolt through her that left her unsteady. She had not expected this. She had expected distance, indifference, the sharp lines of class and duty separating them. But instead, she found herself staring into the eyes of a man who, against all odds, seemed to understand her pain, and worse, seemed to feel something more for her. Her heart raced in her chest, torn between the impulse to flee and the dangerous pull of the moment. The willow tree, her silent witness, swayed as if urging her to make a choice. But before she could respond, the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. Thomas took a step back, his expression torn, as if realizing the enormity of what he had just confessed. "I shouldn't have said that," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't expect anything from you." Eliza, her own emotions in turmoil, didn't know what to say. The wind whispered through the leaves above them, filling the silence that stretched between them. For the first time since their paths had crossed, she saw Thomas not as the enemy, but as a man as lost as she was. And yet, as much as she wanted to believe in the possibility of something more, the wounds of the past still ran too deep. "Perhaps it's better that you didn't," she finally said, her voice softer now, though the edge of uncertainty lingered. Without another word, she turned and walked away from the willow tree, leaving Thomas standing alone beneath its sweeping branches, the weight of his unspoken desires hanging heavily in the air. Chapter 5. The Dance of Attraction. The evening was lit with 1,000 candle flames, each flickering within crystal chandeliers that cast a golden glow across the grand ballroom of Willowbrook Manor. The air inside was heavy with the scent of roses and lavender, arranged meticulously around the room to evoke elegance. Musicians played a waltz, their instruments weaving a melody that set the rhythm for the night's festivities. Guests, draped in silks and satins, glided across the marble floor in graceful pairs, while laughter and hushed conversation hummed in the background like the gentle murmur of bees. Eliza stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the scene unfold before her with a mix of detachment and silent resentment. The grandeur of the manor, its chandeliers, the gowns, the jewels, everything was a reminder of the life she once might have had. She felt out of place among the finery, even though she wore a gown borrowed from the lady of the house, a soft blue silk that suited her slender frame but felt foreign on her skin. But her thoughts were elsewhere. They hovered like a storm cloud over Thomas Harrington, who moved effortlessly through the crowd, a faint smile on his lips as he exchanged pleasantries with his guests. She had watched him throughout the evening, his presence magnetic even though she wished to look away. His polished demeanor, the easy charm that seemed to flow so naturally from him, only deepened the wall of resentment that she had built between them. This was his world, one of privilege and ease, while she remained on the periphery, forever reminded of what she had lost. "Eliza!" His voice, deep and composed, startled her. She hadn't realized he had come so close, and now he stood before her, an unreadable expression on his face. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if even the formalities of the evening could not contain his natural restlessness. His eyes, though cold at first glance, held something more beneath the surface, something that unsettled her. "Mr. Harrington," she replied, her voice steady but clipped. "I trust you're enjoying the evening?" he asked, though his tone carried no real curiosity. "I am, as much as one can." There was a silence, heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. His gaze flicked briefly to the couples twirling across the floor, then back to her. For a moment, something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of resolve. Without warning, he extended his hand toward her. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" Eliza blinked in surprise. Of all the things she had expected tonight, this was not one of them. Her instincts screamed at her to refuse, to turn away from this man who had become the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in her life. And yet, beneath her indignation, there was a dangerous pull. The tension between them, though often bitter, was undeniably electric, and part of her, however much she wished to deny it, wanted to know what it would feel like to step into that charged space with him. She hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, firm but not overbearing, and in an instant, she was being led onto the dance floor. The waltz had shifted into a slower, more deliberate rhythm by the time they joined the others. As Thomas took her into his arms, she was acutely aware of the closeness between them. His hand rested lightly on her waist, the other still holding hers, their bodies moving in synchrony to the music. Despite the layers of fabric between them, Eliza could feel the warmth of him, and it unsettled her far more than she was willing to admit. "I must say, Miss Carter, you have a rather remarkable ability to look displeased at such a delightful occasion," he said, his tone teasing but measured. Eliza's lips curved into a wry smile. And you, Mr. Harrington, have a remarkable ability to pretend everything is as it should be. Thomas's smile faltered slightly, though his composure remained intact. I suppose we all wear masks, do we not? Some just wear them better than others. She glanced up at him, her gaze sharp. Is that what you think this is? A mask? What part of this performance, she said, sweeping her eyes across the ballroom, is real to you? His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then his voice softened, the teasing edge replaced with something deeper. You seem to think that just because my family owns this estate, and because I am fortunate enough to be born into wealth, that none of this weighs on me, that none of it is real. But you, of all people, should know better. Eliza felt a flicker of guilt but quickly smothered it. Perhaps, but it doesn't change the fact that Willowbrook was taken from my family. Taken? His voice grew quiet, but the tension in his words was unmistakable. Is that how you see it? How else should I see it? She shot back. Your family's wealth and privilege, this estate, it's all built on the ruin of others. People like my father, who lost everything. The air between them thickened, their bodies still moving in time to the music, but their words cutting deeper with each exchange. She saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes, the mask of aristocratic indifference cracking just enough to reveal something raw beneath. And do you think it's so easy for me? He said, his voice now low and laced with an intensity that caught her off guard. Do you think I haven't felt the weight of that inheritance every day of my life? To be the one who must uphold a legacy I had no hand in shaping? His words caught her off guard, and for a moment she faltered in the dance, missing a step. Thomas quickly steadied her, pulling her closer to him as they continued to glide across the floor, the proximity between them now unbearable. Then why uphold it? She whispered, her voice betraying her confusion. Why pretend? He looked down at her, his expression softening as if he too was torn between anger and something far more vulnerable. Because, Eliza, he murmured, when you've inherited something this large, you don't always have the choice to walk away. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Eliza saw not just the privileged heir, but a man trapped by the expectations of his family, his wealth, and his station. It was a revelation that unsettled her. The dance was coming to an end, the final notes of the waltz drawing to a close. As the music faded, so too did the sharpness of their conversation. But the tension between them had only deepened, thickened with the weight of everything left unsaid. They stood for a moment, their faces close, their breathing slightly uneven. Eliza felt the urge to pull away, to create distance before this unfamiliar feeling could take root. But for a single, breathless moment, neither of them moved. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Carter," Thomas finally said, his voice strained, as if he too was battling some internal conflict. She nodded, her throat tight with emotions she didn't quite understand. "You're welcome, Mr. Harrington." With that, he let go of her hand and turned, walking away into the crowd. Eliza remained where she was, her heart racing, her mind a whirl of confusion. This was not the man she thought she knew. And for the first time, she wasn't sure whether to be relieved or afraid of what that might mean. Chapter 6. Secrets of the Past. The morning mist clung to the air, casting a veil of pale light over Willowbrook's sweeping grounds. Eliza paced the length of her small room in the servants' quarters, her heart thundering beneath her chest. In her hands she clutched a letter, its edges worn with age, but the ink was still sharp and clear, as if mocking her. The letter had not been meant for her eyes. This she knew the moment she began reading. It had been tucked away, hidden beneath a stack of old books in the library, and she'd found it by chance. But nothing about this discovery felt accidental. The words on the page blurred as her pulse quickened, anger surging through her veins like a storm ready to break. Her father's name was mentioned in the letter, written with cold